Let's get started. Story number 1.
The cemetery sat at the edge of town, hidden behind a grove of towering oaks and a crumbling stone wall. It wasn't on any tourist map, and even the locals preferred to keep their distance. No one knew who originally owned it or why it had been abandoned, but it was clear that the place carried a history heavier than its unmarked graves. I learned about the cemetery from my grandmother. She called it Hollow Ridge, though it had no official name. Growing up, she'd always warned me, don't go near that place after sundown. It's where the restless go to wander. I brushed it off as an old woman's superstition, a relic of a time when people believed in curses and spirits. But one autumn night, curiosity got the better of me. It was late October, and the air had turned crisp. I was visiting my hometown for the first time in years, and everything about it felt smaller and quieter than I remembered. My childhood friend, Mike, and I had spent the evening catching up at a local diner. After too much coffee and nostalgia, he brought up Hollow Ridge. You ever hear about the boy buried there? He asked, his tone casual but his eyes serious. What boy? I replied. Mike leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. Back in the 1950s, there was this kid, Evan Parker. He went missing for weeks, and when they finally found him, he was dead, buried in that cemetery. Thing is, no one knows who put him there or why. Ever since, people say they've seen him wandering around calling for his mother. I scoffed, though a chill ran down my spine. Come on, you don't actually believe that, do you? Mike shrugged. I don't know, but I wouldn't mess with that place. People who do always come back different. It was meant to be a warning, but all it did was pique my interest. That night, around 11 p.m., I grabbed a flashlight, a jacket, and my phone and drove out to Hollow Ridge. The road leading there was narrow and winding, flanked by dense woods. When I finally reached the cemetery, I parked my car and stared at the gate. The iron bars were rusted, and the latch hung loose, swaying gently in the breeze. The air was colder than it should have been, and the night was unnaturally quiet. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness. I pushed the gate open, its hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The cemetery was overgrown, its headstones leaning at odd angles. Some were so old the inscriptions had worn away, while others bore dates that stretched back to the early 1800s. I walked slowly, my flashlight casting long shadows across the uneven ground. Evan Parker, I murmured to myself, scanning the names on the headstones. Where are you? About halfway through the cemetery, I found it. The grave was smaller than the others, marked by a simple stone that read, Evan Parker, 1947 to 1955. Rest in peace. A pile of wilted flowers lay at the base of the headstone, though they looked far too fresh for a grave this old. As I stood there, the temperature seemed to plummet. My breath came out in visible puffs, and an overwhelming sense of sadness washed over me. It wasn't mine. It felt foreign, like I was carrying someone else's grief. Who's there? A child's voice whispered, soft and tremulous. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Hello? I called out, my voice shaky. Is someone there? The voice didn't answer, but a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a boy, no older than 8, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, a button-down shirt, suspenders, and shorts. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide with fear. Are you Evan? I asked, my throat dry. The boy nodded, but said nothing. He raised a trembling hand and pointed toward the woods at the edge of the cemetery. She's looking for me, he whispered. Who? I asked, but he didn't answer. Instead, he turned and began walking toward the trees. Wait, I called, chasing after him. My flashlight flickered, the beam struggling to cut through the thickening mist. By the time I reached the edge of the woods, the boy was gone. That's when I heard it. A low, keening wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a woman's voice, filled with anguish. Evan, she sobbed. Evan, where are you? The sound sent shivers down my spine. I wanted to turn back, to run to my car and forget I'd ever come here. But something compelled me to move forward. I stepped into the woods, the underbrush crunching under my boots. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their bare branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The air was thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. As I walked, the wailing grew louder, more desperate. Then I saw her. She was standing in a small clearing, her back to me. Her hair was long and tangled, and her dress was tattered and stained. She rocked back and forth, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "Evan," she whispered, her voice cracking, "come back to me." I took a step closer and the sound of my movement made her freeze. Slowly, she turned to face me. Her eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to swallow the light. Her face was gaunt, her skin stretched tightly over her bones. "You're not Evan," she hissed, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. I stumbled backward, my flashlight slipping from my grasp. The beam spun wildly, illuminating her for just a moment before plunging us both into darkness. I scrambled to pick it up, but when I shone it on the clearing again, she was gone. The air grew colder and the wailing returned, now joined by a chorus of whispers. They surrounded me, closing in from all sides. "Leave," the voices demanded. "You don't belong here." Panic set in and I turned, running blindly through the woods. Branches clawed at my face and arms, but I didn't stop until I burst back into the cemetery. I sprinted to my car, fumbling with the keys as the whispers followed me. When I finally got the engine started, I glanced back toward the cemetery gates. The boy was standing there, watching me. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes seemed to plead with me. I didn't wait to find out what he wanted. I sped away, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I never went back to Hollow Ridge, and I've never told anyone what happened that night. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I see Evan and the woman in the clearing. I hear her wails, feel the oppressive cold, and remember the whispers telling me to leave. And I wonder if they'll ever truly let me go. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The cemetery had always been there, perched on the edge of town like a shadow no one wanted to acknowledge. Overgrown with wild ivy and guarded by a wrought iron fence that seemed to groan under its own weight, it was a place the locals avoided. Yet, it called to Rebecca. Rebecca had moved to town 3 months ago, seeking solitude after a messy divorce. The small, quiet town promised the escape she craved, and the old Victorian house she rented was both affordable and charming. It was perfect, except for its proximity to the cemetery. Her back porch overlooked it, and though she tried to ignore it, she found herself often staring out at the sea of crooked headstones. It started with the lights. One evening, while sipping tea on her porch, Rebecca noticed faint orbs of light moving through the cemetery. At first, she dismissed them as fireflies or kids playing with flashlights, but the movements were too deliberate, too synchronized, as if the lights were weaving through the graves with purpose. Curiosity got the better of her. Armed with her phone and a jacket, Rebecca decided to take a closer look. The air grew colder as she approached the cemetery gates, the crisp scent of damp earth filling her nostrils. The lights flickered and disappeared as soon as she stepped inside. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper. Only silence answered. Feeling foolish, Rebecca turned to leave, but a sharp whisper stopped her in her tracks. "Rebecca." She spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. "Who's there?" No one was there. The cemetery was still, the shadows deepening as the moon disappeared behind a cloud. Convinced she was hearing things, Rebecca hurried back to her house, locking the door behind her. That night, she dreamed of the cemetery. In her dream, she wandered among the graves, the air heavy with the smell of decay. A figure stood in the distance watching her. Its face was obscured, but its eyes burned like embers. When she woke, her chest was tight, and the smell of damp earth lingered in her bedroom. Over the next week, Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Shadows seemed to move just out of her line of sight, and at night, she swore she heard whispers coming from the cemetery. One evening, determined to confront her fear, Rebecca returned to the cemetery. The air was colder than it should have been for spring, and the wind carried an eerie stillness. She walked among the graves, reading the faded inscriptions. Beloved mother, cherished friend, gone too soon. Near the center of the cemetery, she found an old, crumbling mausoleum. Its heavy stone door was slightly ajar, revealing darkness within. A chill ran down her spine, but something compelled her to step closer. Inside, the air was damp and suffocating. The faint glow of her phone flashlight illuminated the interior. Stone walls lined with niches, most of them empty. At the center of the room was a single stone sarcophagus, its lid cracked. Rebecca felt a pull toward it, an invisible force drawing her closer. She hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to leave, but her feet moved on their own. She peered into the crack, expecting to see nothing but darkness. Instead, she saw a face. It was pale and gaunt, its hollow eyes staring up at her. Rebecca stumbled back, dropping her phone. The sound of her breathing echoed in the small space as she scrambled to retrieve it. When she shone the light on the sarcophagus again, the face was gone. A voice filled the mausoleum, low and guttural. "Why have you disturbed me?" Rebecca's blood ran cold. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. The air grew colder, her breath visible in the dim light. "Please," she whispered. "I didn't mean to." "Too late," the voice interrupted, resonating from all around her. The ground beneath her feet trembled and the walls seemed to close in. Rebecca's flashlight flickered, plunging her into darkness. She felt a hand, cold and skeletal, graze her shoulder. She screamed. When she came to, she was lying outside the mausoleum, the morning sun filtering through the trees. Her phone was dead and her body ached as if she had been dragged. Rebecca staggered home, locking herself inside. She spent the rest of the day trying to convince herself it had been a dream, but the bruises on her arms told a different story. That night, she awoke to the sound of scratching at her bedroom window. She froze, her heart pounding. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. Summoning her courage, Rebecca pulled back the curtain. A face stared back at her, pale, hollow-eyed, and filled with malice. She screamed, but when she looked again, the face was gone. The whispers returned that night, louder and more insistent. They filled her home, growing into a cacophony of voices. Rebecca curled up in her bed, covering her ears, but the voices seeped into her mind. "Leave," they demanded. "This is not your place." The next morning, Rebecca packed her belongings and left town. She never returned to the house or the cemetery, but the whispers stayed with her. To this day, she dreams of the mausoleum and the face within, and when the wind is just right, she swears she can still hear the voices calling her name. Story the end.
Story number 3.
It all started with a dare. My friends and I were young and bored, the kind of combination that always led to bad decisions. It was a warm summer night, the air heavy with the scent of blooming jasmine and freshly cut grass. We'd been sitting around a bonfire in Sam's backyard when the topic of the old Pine Hill Cemetery came up. "You wouldn't last 10 minutes there alone," Sam said, his grin cocky as he poked at the fire with a stick. "I would," I shot back. "It's just a bunch of stones and dirt. Nothing to be afraid of." "Prove it," Sam said, leaning forward. "Go there now, spend 30 minutes alone, and come back with a photo of the mausoleum." The others cheered him on, and before I knew it, I was driving down the dark country road toward the cemetery. It wasn't far, just on the outskirts of town, hidden behind a line of tall, whispering pines. The cemetery had been abandoned for decades, its last burial taking place sometime in the 1940s. Over the years, it had gained a reputation not for any documented hauntings, but because of the uneasy feeling people claimed to get when they visited. I arrived just after midnight. The cemetery gates were rusty and slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. Beyond them, the headstones stretched out like crooked teeth, their inscriptions barely visible under the faint light of the crescent moon. I parked my car on the gravel road and grabbed my phone for the photo. As I stepped through the gates, the world seemed to grow quieter. The distant hum of cicadas and the occasional hoot of an owl faded into an oppressive silence. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the eerie stillness was nothing more than my own nerves. The mausoleum was at the center of the cemetery, a small stone building with a peaked roof and a single iron door. It wasn't far, but the path leading to it twisted between rows of forgotten graves. I kept my flashlight trained on the ground, avoiding the roots and stones that jutted up from the earth like obstacles meant to trip the unwary. Halfway there, I noticed something strange. The temperature had dropped sharply and my breath hung in the air like a thin mist. I stopped, turning in a slow circle, my flashlight sweeping across the graves. That's when I saw it. A shadow darting between the headstones, quick and silent. "Hello?" I called, my voice louder than I intended. No answer. I told myself it was probably a stray animal or the wind playing tricks on my eyes. Still, I quickened my pace, eager to get the photo and leave. When I reached the mausoleum, I hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness visible between the rusted iron bars. I raised my phone to snap a picture, but before I could press the button, I heard it. A faint whisper. "Leave." The voice was soft, almost gentle, but it froze me in place. It seemed to come from inside the mausoleum, drifting out like a cold breath. My hand trembled as I took the photo, the flash briefly illuminating the worn carvings on the door. Then the whisper came again, louder this time. "Leave. Now." I stumbled back, nearly dropping my phone. The air around me felt heavy, pressing against my chest like an invisible weight. I turned to run, but before I could take a step, the iron door of the mausoleum creaked open wider. Inside, I saw a figure. It was pale and translucent, its features indistinct, like a photograph out of focus. It stood perfectly still, its head tilted slightly as if watching me. My flashlight flickered, the beam stuttering and fading, leaving me in near darkness. Panic surged through me, and I bolted, my footsteps pounding against the ground. The cemetery seemed larger now, the rows of graves stretching endlessly in every direction. The gate was nowhere in sight, and the whisper followed me, growing louder with each step. "Leave. Leave. Leave." The voice wasn't gentle anymore. It was urgent, filled with a desperation that bordered on anger. I felt something cold brush against my arm, like icy fingers trailing over my skin. I didn't look back. I couldn't. When I finally burst through the gates and into the gravel road, I collapsed against my car, gasping for breath. The whisper was gone, replaced by the normal sounds of the night. The air was warm again, and the oppressive weight had lifted. I scrambled into my car and sped away, not daring to look in the rearview mirror until I was safely back in town. When I reached Sam's house, I told him what had happened, expecting him to laugh it off. But when I showed him the photo, his face went pale. There in the picture was the iron door of the mausoleum, and just behind it, the faint outline of the figure I'd seen. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark, and its mouth was open in a silent scream. I don't know what I saw that night or why it let me leave, but I haven't been back to Pine Hill Cemetery since. Even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there, that the whispers weren't just warnings, they were a plea. Story the end.
Story number 4.
It began with a dare. Sam had always considered himself fearless. Ghost stories and tales of the supernatural were nothing more than entertainment to him, good for a laugh, maybe a chill, but nothing real. So when his best friend, Eric, dared him to spend a night in Old Hollow Cemetery, Sam barely hesitated. The cemetery was infamous in their small town. Tucked away on the outskirts, hidden behind a row of ancient oak trees, it had been abandoned for decades. Its wrought iron gates were rusted and partially collapsed, the gravestones weathered and overgrown. Rumors swirled about strange lights and whispers in the night, but no one ever stayed long enough to investigate. The dare was simple. Stay in the cemetery from midnight to sunrise. If Sam could manage it, Eric would pay him $50. Easy money, Sam thought. Just before midnight, Sam parked his car on the dirt road leading to the cemetery and stepped out into the chilly autumn air. Armed with a flashlight, a thermos of coffee, and a blanket, he made his way through the twisted iron gates. The night was eerily quiet. The only sounds the crunch of leaves beneath his boots and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. The cemetery was even more unsettling than he'd expected. Rows of tilted gravestones jutted out from the earth like broken teeth, their inscriptions faded and unreadable. A decrepit mausoleum loomed near the center, its stone facade cracked and covered in moss. Sam picked a spot near the mausoleum and settled in, leaning against a large, flat gravestone. He checked his phone. 12:03 a.m. He had 6 hours to kill. The first hour passed uneventfully. Sam scrolled through his phone, sipped his coffee, and occasionally glanced around. The cemetery was silent, save for the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of a nearby bush. At 1:15 a.m., he heard the first sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a soft whisper carried on the breeze. Sam froze, his flashlights sweeping across the cemetery. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. No response. He shook his head and chuckled nervously. "Get a grip," he muttered to himself. It was probably just the wind or an animal moving through the brush. But then it came again, louder this time. A whisper, but not just a whisper. Words, faint and disjointed, but unmistakably human. Leave, not welcome. Sam's heart began to race. He stood up, shining his flashlight in every direction. The beam flickered for a moment, then stabilized. "Who's there?" he demanded. The cemetery remained silent. Sam took a deep breath and sat back down, telling himself it was his imagination. He checked his phone. 1:40 a.m. The next sound was louder. It came from the direction of the mausoleum, a low, grinding noise like stone scraping against stone. Sam whipped his flashlight toward it, the beam cutting through the darkness. The heavy stone door of the mausoleum, which had been sealed when he arrived, was now slightly ajar. He stared at it, his pulse pounding in his ears. "Nope," he said aloud, standing and grabbing his blanket. "I'm not doing this." But as he turned to leave, the air seemed to grow heavier, colder. His breath puffed out in visible clouds, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Then he heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping coming from inside the mausoleum. Curiosity and fear battled within him. Against his better judgment, he stepped closer, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Hello?" he called again, his voice cracking. The tapping stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, from deep within the mausoleum, a voice echoed, "Why have you come?" Sam stumbled backward, nearly dropping his flashlight. The voice was deep, guttural, and filled with a sadness that sent chills down his spine. "I'm just here on a dare," he stammered. "I'll leave, okay?" The air grew colder still, and the door of the mausoleum creaked open wider. "Stay," the voice commanded. "Stay and see." Sam's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. Against his will, he found himself stepping closer to the mausoleum, drawn by an unseen force. The interior was dark, the smell of damp earth and decay overwhelming. Sam's flashlight flickered again, casting erratic shadows on the stone walls. Inside, the tapping resumed, louder now, echoing off the walls. At the far end of the mausoleum, a figure stood. It was shrouded in darkness, its form indistinct, but its eyes, glowing faintly in the dim light, bore into Sam with an intensity that made him want to scream. Who are you?" Sam managed to choke out. The figure didn't move, but the voice echoed again, filling the small space. "We are the Forgotten, left to rot, left to fade. Why have you disturbed us?" "I didn't mean to," Sam whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I'll go. I swear, I'll go." The figure raised an arm, pointing toward the entrance. "Then leave, but take this with you." Before Sam could ask what it meant, the flashlight died completely, plunging the mausoleum into total darkness. He bolted, tripping over the threshold and scrambling through the cemetery, the whispers rising behind him like a chorus of the damned. He didn't stop running until he reached his car. Fumbling with the keys, he started the engine and sped away, not daring to look back. When he finally reached home, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon, he noticed something strange. His clothes were damp, not just from sweat, but from some kind of dark, foul-smelling liquid. His hands shook as he undressed, and he froze when he caught sight of his reflection in the mirror. Across his chest, etched as if by invisible claws, were the words, "Remember us." Sam never spoke of that night to anyone. He avoided the cemetery, even driving miles out of his way to ensure he didn't pass it. But sometimes late at night he still heard the whispers, and he knew he always would. Story, the end.
Story number 5.
The night the town called the Fog Night came as it did every year, blanketing Willow Creek Cemetery in a thick, suffocating mist. There were whispers passed down for generations that the fog wasn't natural. The old-timers swore it was the restless spirits stirring, their voices carried on the chilled air. But for 18-year-old Clara Bennett, the fog was nothing more than an excuse for her little brother Jamie to demand a bedtime story about ghosts. Clara and Jamie lived in a small, creaky house right across from the cemetery. Their mother had always hated the location, calling it a home for shadows, but it was all they could afford after their father passed. To Clara, the cemetery was simply a place she passed by on the way to school. A place that had always been quiet, too quiet. On the night of the fog, Clara was alone with Jamie. Their mother was working her usual night shift at the diner, leaving Clara in charge. After a dinner of grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, Jamie asked for a story, as always. "Tell me about the Gray Lady," Jamie said, pulling the blanket up to his chin. "Again? You've heard that one 100 times, Clara said, rolling her eyes. "Please?" Jamie pleaded, his voice small and eager. Clara sighed, sat on the edge of his bed, and began. "Okay, so the Gray Lady was a widow who lost her husband in the war. She visited his grave every day, rain or shine, to leave flowers, but one day she disappeared. Some say she died of a broken heart. Others say the fog claimed her." Jamie's eyes widened. And now she wanders the cemetery looking for her husband, right? Right, Clara said, standing up. And if you don't go to sleep, she'll come looking for you next. Not funny, Jamie puted, pulling the blanket over his head. Clara chuckled and kissed his forehead. Good night, Jamie. The house fell silent as Jamie drifted off, but the fog outside pressed against the windows like something alive. Clara tried to ignore it as she settled into the living room with a book. The old floorboards creaked and the wind howled faintly. But then she heard something else, a distant sound like whispering. Clara froze, her heart racing. She told herself it was just the wind, but the sound grew louder. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from Jamie's room. She hurried down the hallway, pushing open his door. Jamie was sitting up in bed, his eyes wide with terror. Clara, he whispered. She's here. Who's here? Clara asked, her voice trembling. The Gray Lady, Jamie said, pointing to the window. Clara turned and saw it, a shadowy figure standing just outside the window, its outline barely visible through the fog. She felt her blood run cold. Stay here, she said, though her legs felt like jelly. Clara grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and stepped outside. The fog was so thick she could barely see a foot in front of her. She swept the beam of light across the yard, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Hello? She called out, her voice echoing eerily. There was no answer, but the whispering returned. It was closer now, circling her like an unseen predator. Clara turned in every direction, but the fog seemed to swallow everything. Then, she saw it. The figure was standing at the edge of the cemetery, its back to her. It was draped in what looked like tattered gray fabric, its head bowed. Hey! Clara shouted, more out of fear than bravery. The figure didn't move. Clara hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to run, but something pulled her forward. She stepped onto the cemetery grounds, the grass wet and cold beneath her feet. Who are you? Clara demanded, her voice shaking. The figure turned slowly and Clara gasped. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a void, a black emptiness that seemed to pull the light from her flashlight. Clara stumbled backward, tripping over a gravestone. She hit the ground hard, her flashlight rolling out of reach. The whispering grew deafening, surrounding her, invading her mind. Leave, a voice hissed, deep and guttural. Clara scrambled to her feet and ran, not stopping until she was back inside the house. She slammed the door and locked it, her chest heaving. What happened? Jamie asked, his voice small and frightened. Clara didn't know what to say. She pulled Jamie into a tight hug and said the only thing she could think of. It's okay. We're safe now. But they weren't. That night, Clara dreamed of the cemetery. She was standing in the fog, surrounded by graves. The Gray Lady was there, her void-like face staring into Clara's soul. Now find him, the Gray Lady whispered. Free me. Clara woke with a start, her heart pounding. She glanced at the clock. It was 3:33 a.m. The house was deathly quiet. She tried to dismiss the dream, but the words stuck with her. Find him. The next day, Clara did something she had never done before. She entered the cemetery during daylight. Jamie stayed at home, too frightened to come along. Clara wandered through the rows of graves, searching for anything that might explain the Gray Lady's words. After nearly an hour, she found it. A grave covered in dead flowers, the headstone so weathered she could barely make out the name. James Whitaker, she read aloud. The date of death was nearly a century ago, but the name struck her. It was her brother's name, Jamie. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't believe in coincidences. She knelt down and brushed away the dirt and debris, revealing more of the inscription. Beloved husband of Eleanor Whitaker. Eleanor, the Gray Lady. Clara felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of urgency. She didn't know why, but she felt compelled to do something, anything, to bring peace to the restless spirit. That night, she returned to the cemetery, armed with nothing but her flashlight and a bouquet of fresh flowers. Jamie begged her not to go, but Clara couldn't ignore the pull. The fog was thicker than ever, the air heavy with an unnatural chill. Clara made her way to James Whitaker's grave, her heart pounding. She placed the flowers on the grave and whispered, "I'm here to help." The whispering returned, louder this time, but it didn't feel hostile. It guided her, pulling her toward the center of the cemetery. There, she found an unmarked grave. The earth disturbed as if someone or something had been trying to dig it up. Clara hesitated, then began digging with her bare hands. The soil was cold and damp. but she didn't stop. After what felt like hours, her fingers hit something hard. It was a small, rusted locket. Clara opened it and found a faded photograph of a young couple, James and Eleanor. The whispering stopped, replaced by a deep, sorrowful sigh. Clara looked up and saw the gray lady standing a few feet away. She wasn't terrifying now. She was peaceful. Her face was still indistinct, but Clara could feel her gratitude. "Thank you," the gray lady whispered before dissolving into the fog. The cemetery fell silent and the fog began to lift. Clara returned home exhausted but strangely at peace. She never saw the gray lady again, but every year on the anniversary of that night, she placed fresh flowers on James Whitaker's grave, and she made sure Jamie never went near the cemetery again. Story the end.
Story number 6.
When I was 22, I worked as a security guard in my small hometown. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but it paid the bills and kept my nights busy. One of my assignments was patrolling the old Greystone Cemetery, a sprawling burial ground on the outskirts of town that had been around since the late 1800s. Most people avoided the cemetery, especially after dark. It wasn't just the natural eeriness of the place. There were stories. People claimed to have seen lights moving among the gravestones, heard whispers when no one else was around, or felt cold hands brush their skin. I didn't believe in ghosts, though. To me, those were just tales to scare kids or spice up boring small-town gossip. It was a crisp October night when I had my first strange experience. I arrived at the cemetery around 11 p.m. and parked my car just outside the iron gates. My shift was simple: walk the perimeter every hour, check for trespassers, and make sure everything was in order. I had a flashlight, a radio, and a thermos of coffee to keep me company. The cemetery was dead silent, no pun intended. The air was cold and still, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. I started my first patrol, weaving through rows of weathered headstones and overgrown paths. The moonlight cast long shadows, and the beam of my flashlight occasionally caught the glint of marble or the reflective eyes of a raccoon. Everything was normal until I reached the eastern edge of the cemetery where the oldest graves were located. That's when I heard it. A faint whisper, almost like someone calling my name. "Jake." I froze, my flashlight darting across the headstones. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Is someone there?" No response. I told myself it was the wind or maybe an animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. I finished my patrol quickly and returned to the small guard shack near the entrance. For the next hour, I stayed inside, trying to shake off the uneasiness. I told myself I was being paranoid, that cemeteries were naturally creepy places, and there was nothing to worry about. But when it came time for my second patrol, I couldn't ignore the knot of dread in my stomach. As I made my way through the cemetery again, I noticed something odd. The temperature had dropped significantly, and a thin layer of fog had begun to creep in, swirling around the gravestones. My flashlight seemed weaker, its beam barely cutting through the mist. Halfway through the patrol, I heard the whisper again. "Jake?" It was louder this time, clearer, and it came from the direction of the mausoleum. The mausoleum was a massive stone structure near the center of the cemetery. It was old, its iron doors rusted and partially ajar. No one had been buried there in decades, and most people avoided it because of the stories. Stories about strange noises, shadows moving inside, and the feeling of being watched. I should have ignored the voice, should have turned around and gone back to the guard shack. But something compelled me to investigate. I approached the mausoleum cautiously, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The air grew colder with each step, and the fog seemed to thicken around me. When I reached the entrance, I peered inside. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing off the stone walls. At first, I saw nothing but darkness. Then, in the far corner of the mausoleum, I noticed movement. A faint glow, soft and bluish, was emanating from one of the niches where the urns were stored. "Is someone in there?" I asked, stepping inside. The glow pulsed, growing brighter for a moment before fading. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. The air was freezing now, my breath visible in the dim light. When I reached the glowing niche, I saw an urn sitting there, its surface etched with an ornate pattern of vines and flowers. The glow seemed to come from within the urn, and as I reached out to touch it, the whisper came again, louder than ever. "Jake, leave." I jerked my hand back, stumbling away from the niche. The glow flickered and disappeared, plunging the mausoleum into darkness. Then I felt it, a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, my flashlight flailing. No one was there. But the air around me felt heavy, oppressive, like I was being surrounded by an unseen presence. I bolted out of the mausoleum, tripping over the threshold and landing hard on the ground outside. My flashlight rolled away, its beam casting erratic shadows as it spun. From inside the mausoleum, I heard a low, guttural laugh. I didn't wait to see what it was. I grabbed my flashlight and ran, my boots crunching on the gravel path as I made my way back to the guard shack. I locked the door behind me and sat there, shaking until my shift ended. The next morning, I told my supervisor what had happened. He laughed it off, saying I'd let my imagination get the better of me. But I knew what I'd heard, what I'd felt. I quit the job a week later, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching me every time I stepped foot in that cemetery. Years have passed since that night, but I still have nightmares about the mausoleum and the glowing urn. Sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I can still hear the whisper. Jake. Story the end.
Story number 7.
I've always considered myself a rational person, the type who scoffs at ghost stories and rolls my eyes at horror movies. Growing up in a small town in New England, I'd heard all the local legends about haunted places, but I dismissed them as folklore. That all changed one cold autumn night, the night I found myself alone in Black Hollow Cemetery. Black Hollow Cemetery was the oldest burial ground in our town. It sat on a hill, surrounded by a dense forest, its crumbling headstones bearing names of people who had died centuries ago. It wasn't a place people visited, not even during the day. Something about it felt wrong. As kids, we'd dare each other to run up to the gates, but no one was brave enough to go inside. I didn't think much of it back then, just assuming it was another old graveyard that gave people the creeps. It was late October when it happened. I was working as a delivery driver for a local pizza place, saving up money for college. That night, my last delivery was to a house just outside of town, near the woods that bordered Black Hollow Cemetery. I dropped off the order, got back in my car, and turned onto the main road. The trees loomed on either side, their skeletal branches clawing at the night sky. As I drove, my car began to sputter. The headlights dimmed, the engine shuddered, and then it died altogether. I coasted to the side of the road, cursing under my breath. My phone was in my pocket, but when I pulled it out, there was no signal. Typical. I stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at my skin. Through the darkness, I spotted the iron gates of Black Hollow Cemetery, just a few hundred feet away. I shivered. And not just because of the chill. I knew there was an old caretaker's shack near the entrance. Maybe there was a landline I could use to call for help. The gravel crunched under my boots as I approached the gates. They were tall and ornate, rusted with age, and slightly ajar. The cemetery beyond was shrouded in fog, the headstones barely visible under the pale light of the crescent moon. I hesitated for a moment, my breath clouding in the air, then pushed the gate open with a groan. The caretaker's shack was just inside, a small, dilapidated structure with boarded-up windows. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. When I tried the handle, it turned easily, and I stepped inside. The shack was empty, filled with old tools and cobwebs, but in the corner I spotted an old rotary phone. I picked it up, but the line was dead. Great. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye, a photograph sitting on the dusty desk. It showed a man in overalls standing in front of a headstone, his expression grim. The strange thing was, the photo looked new, as if it had been taken recently. I couldn't explain it, but the sight of it sent a chill down my spine. I stepped back outside, the fog seeming thicker than before. As I walked back toward the gate, I heard it. A faint whisper carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then it came again, clearer this time. Help me, I froze, my heart pounding. Hello? I called out, my voice shaky. Is someone there? No response, just the rustling of leaves in the wind. I shook my head, telling myself I was hearing things, and started walking faster. But the whispers grew louder, more urgent. Help me. Please. They seemed to come from deeper within the cemetery. Against my better judgment, I turned toward the sound, my flashlight cutting through the fog. The headstones grew older and more weathered the further I went, some of them tilted at odd angles, their inscriptions worn away by time. Then I saw it, a figure standing by a large oak tree. It was a woman, her silhouette barely visible through the mist. She was wearing a long dress, her head bowed as if in prayer. "Are you okay?" I called out, moving closer. "Do you need help?" She didn't respond. As I approached, I had noticed that her dress was tattered and her hair hung in tangled strands. Something about her posture made my stomach tighten, but I couldn't turn away. I reached out, my hand trembling. "Ma'am?" She lifted her head, and I stumbled back in horror. Her face was pale and sunken, her eyes hollow and black as the void. Her mouth opened, but instead of a scream, a chilling wind rushed past me, carrying the scent of decay. I turned and ran, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I tripped over roots and fallen branches. The whispers were everywhere now, echoing through the cemetery, overlapping and growing louder. "Help us! Don't leave us!" I didn't stop until I reached the gates, throwing myself against them and shoving them open. I sprinted back to my car, not daring to look back, and jumped inside. The engine sputtered to life on the first try, and I floored the gas pedal, speeding away from that cursed place. When I got home, I locked every door and window and didn't sleep a wink that night. The next morning, I told my mom what had happened. She listened quietly, her face pale. "You saw her," she said when I finished. "Who?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "The mourner," she said. "They say she's been there for over 100 years, looking for her lost child. People see her sometimes, but the ones who hear her whispers, they don't usually make it out." I didn't go near Black Hollow Cemetery again after that. I quit my delivery job and avoided that part of town altogether. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up to the sound of whispers outside my window. Help me. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The cemetery was the oldest in the county, its weathered tombstones leaning at odd angles as though bowing under the weight of time. Situated on a lonely hill at the edge of town, it was bordered by a wrought iron fence that had long since succumbed to rust. Most people avoided it, except for the occasional local historian or thrill-seeking teenager. For me, the cemetery wasn't a place of fear, but a subject of fascination. I was a photographer, always on the hunt for locations that carried history in their bones. One late autumn afternoon, I decided to visit the cemetery to capture its haunting beauty before winter blanketed it in snow. The sun was already low in the sky when I arrived, its golden light casting long shadows across the uneven ground. The crunch of leaves under my boots was the only sound as I stepped through the arched gate. I carried my camera and a tripod, eager to document the fading light against the backdrop of cracked tombstones and crumbling mausoleums. As I wandered deeper into the cemetery, I noticed how quiet it was. The usual sounds of the outdoors, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves were absent. It was as if the place existed in its own bubble of silence. Still, I chalked it up to the time of year and continued my work, setting up my tripod near an elaborate gravestone covered in ivy. That's when I saw the first sign that something wasn't right. Through the viewfinder of my camera, I noticed movement near one of the older graves. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or perhaps an animal. But when I looked directly at the spot, there was nothing there. I shrugged it off, focusing instead on getting the perfect shot. Minutes later, as I reviewed the images on my camera's screen, I froze. In one of the photos, a faint figure stood near the grave. It was blurry, barely more than a smudge of light, but it was unmistakably human-shaped. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. The figure hadn't been there when I took the photo. The wind picked up suddenly, carrying with it a faint whisper. It was so soft that I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded close, almost as if someone was standing just behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The only response was the wind whistling through the trees. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination getting the better of me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows seemed darker now, the air colder. I decided to take one last photo before packing up and leaving. I aimed my camera at a small mausoleum at the far end of the cemetery, its stone walls cracked and covered in moss. As I clicked the shutter, I felt a sudden, icy chill. It wasn't the kind of cold that came from the dropping temperature. It felt alive, pressing against my skin and seeping into my bones. I turned to leave, but my legs felt heavy, as though something was holding me in place. The whispers returned, louder this time, though still incomprehensible. Panic set in, and I grabbed my gear, stumbling toward the gate as fast as I could. That's when I heard it. Footsteps behind me. They were slow and deliberate, crunching the dry leaves with every step. I stopped, too afraid to turn around. The footsteps stopped too. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing in the stillness. There was no reply, only the oppressive silence. I took a deep breath and forced myself to look back. The path behind me was empty, but the shadows seemed to ripple, shifting like water. My eyes were drawn to one of the graves, where a figure now stood. It was a woman, or at least it looked like one. She wore a long, tattered dress that swayed as though caught in a breeze I couldn't feel. Her face was pale and indistinct, her features blurred as if hidden behind a veil of fog. She raised a hand pointing toward the mausoleum I had just photographed. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The air grew colder still, the whispers swelling into a mournful wail. It sounded like a cry for help, or perhaps a warning. "I don't understand," I stammered, clutching my camera like it could somehow protect me. The woman tilted her head, her form flickering like a dying flame. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. The chill lifted and the whispers faded into silence. I didn't wait to see if she would return. I ran, my heart pounding in my chest, not stopping until I was back at my car. Once inside, I locked the doors and sat there, trembling. My camera dangled from my neck, its weight a reminder of what I'd seen. When I got home, I reviewed the photos on my computer. Most of them were ordinary, beautiful even, but the last one sent a shiver down my spine. In the photo of the mausoleum, the faint outline of the woman was visible, standing in the doorway and staring directly at the camera. I never went back to the cemetery after that night. The photos remained tucked away in a drawer, a reminder of something I can't explain. I don't know what she wanted or why she chose to show herself to me, but I'll never forget the icy chill of her presence or the mournful sound of her whispers. Story the end.
Story number 9.
I had always been a skeptic when it came to things like ghosts. Growing up in a small town, I had heard all the local legends about haunted houses, eerie woods, and, of course, the old cemetery on the edge of town. But to me, they were just stories, tales passed down from generation to keep kids from sneaking out at night or wandering too far. Nothing more. That all changed one autumn evening in 2012. It was a Friday night, and I had just finished my shift at the local diner. The air outside was crisp, and the leaves had started to change color, a perfect representation of fall in New England. My friends and I had been talking for weeks about going out to the cemetery at night. Some said it was haunted. Others claimed to have seen shadows moving among the graves. I didn't believe any of it, but I had to admit that the thought of visiting at night had a certain thrill to it. We drove out to the cemetery in my friend Evan's car. There were 5 of us: Evan, me, Claire, Ben, and Rachel. As we pulled up to the cemetery gate, the dark shape of the old wrought iron fence loomed against the night sky. The cemetery itself was large, older than most in the area, with rows of weathered headstones that had seen centuries pass. The gate creaked as Evan pushed it open, and we parked near the entrance. "Let's keep it short," Claire said, her voice a little shaky. She was the most nervous of the group, but she still wanted to come. "Just a quick walk, all right?" Ben, who was always the one to egg people on, grinned. "Come on, Claire. It'll be fun. Nothing's going to happen." We all got out of the car, our breath fogging in the chilly air. The moon was full, casting long shadows across the cemetery as we began walking along the gravel path. The faint rustling of leaves was the only sound, and the occasional hoot of an owl added to the eeriness of the moment. As we walked deeper into the cemetery, the wind picked up, causing the trees to sway ominously. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I looked around, half expecting to see someone or something lurking among the graves, but all I saw were the old, worn stones standing in silence. We reached the back of the cemetery where a small, crumbling mausoleum stood. It looked abandoned, its iron doors rusted and bent. A few of the stones in front had names barely legible, the markings worn away by the years. "I heard someone died here under strange circumstances," Rachel said in a whisper, her voice carrying the usual intrigue that came with our group's fascination with the creepy and unexplained. Something about an old caretaker who vanished without a trace. I don't know about you, but I'm not sticking around to find out, Claire said nervously, instead looking around at the headstones. Evan, who had been quiet for a while, pointed to a tall, ornate stone near the mausoleum. Let's take a picture with that one. It looks creepy as hell. Against my better judgment, I followed Evan and the others as they walked toward the stone. The air felt colder now, almost unnatural. I couldn't explain it, but I felt a sudden heaviness in my chest, like the very ground beneath me was pressing down. I shook off the sensation, telling myself it was just my imagination. We posed for the photo, and as I glanced around, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but as I looked closer, I realized there was a figure standing near the far corner of the cemetery. It was a tall, thin shape, almost like a person, but it didn't move. The moonlight glinted off something metallic, perhaps a chain or a long coat, I wasn't sure. Did you guys see that? I asked, my voice quiet but urgent. What? Evan looked at me, his brow furrowed. Over there, I said, pointing toward the figure. Everyone turned, but by the time they looked, the figure was gone. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I had seen. It could have been a trick of the light or a person walking through the cemetery, but something about it didn't sit right with me. Let's go, Claire said, her voice trembling. This place gives me the creeps. We all agreed and started heading back toward the entrance. But as we walked, the temperature seemed to drop even further. My breath was now visible in the air, and I could see the others shivering. The path seemed longer on the way back, the shadows growing thicker and darker with every step. Then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper like a voice just beyond the edge of hearing. It wasn't words, just a sound, mournful, like a distant sob. I stopped in my tracks. Did you hear that? I asked. Hear what? Ben replied, clearly impatient. I swear I heard something. Like someone crying, I said, scanning the darkness around us. It's probably just an animal, Rachel said, though she sounded uncertain. But the whisper came again, louder this time, and this time there was no mistaking it. It was a voice, low and guttural, murmuring something unintelligible. I turned to look at my friends, their faces pale and wide-eyed. The air felt heavier now, thick with a presence that none of us could deny. Without warning, Claire screamed. It was a high-pitched, terrified scream, and we all spun around to see her standing at the edge of the path, pointing at something in the distance. I saw it! I saw it! She gasped, backing away, her eyes wild with fear. Claire, what are you talking about? Rachel asked, but there was a nervous edge to her voice. There was someone, no, something, standing right there. Claire pointed shakily toward a gravestone at the far end of the cemetery. It was tall, like a man, but its face was wrong. We all turned to look, but the area she was pointing to was empty. The wind whistled through the trees, and all that could be heard was the rustling of leaves. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. We didn't wait around any longer. Claire was trembling, and even Evan, usually the brave one, was visibly shaken. We rushed back to the car, our footsteps echoing in the silence. The moment we were inside, I slammed the door shut and started the engine, eager to leave that place behind. As we drove away, the cemetery grew smaller in the rearview mirror, but the sense of unease remained. None of us spoke for the rest of the drive, the silence hanging heavy in the air. I kept my eyes on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us out of that cemetery. Something we hadn't seen, but we all knew was there. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made my heart race. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw the tall figure from the cemetery, standing just beyond the edge of the darkness, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 10.
The old cemetery on the outskirts of town had always intrigued me. Its gates, long rusted and barely holding together, creaked whenever the wind blew, and the stone paths leading through it were cracked and uneven, as though nature was slowly reclaiming what had once been a place of reverence. My grandfather had been buried there many years ago, but I had never visited his grave. It wasn't that I had anything against the place, it just seemed forgotten. I had spent most of my life avoiding it. The town itself had long since grown around it, leaving the cemetery isolated and forgotten its history buried under layers of neglect. It was a place people whispered about, but no one spoke of it openly, especially not after dark. My own parents had cautioned me against going there, but as I grew older and became more curious, I started to wonder about the stories that were left unspoken. One evening in late October, the air crisp and cool with the promise of an impending frost, I finally decided to see it for myself. I had been working on a project for my photography class, and I thought the cemetery, with its decaying tombstones and creeping ivy, would make for the perfect subject. I drove out there just as the sun began to set, the orange light casting long shadows across the road. When I arrived, the cemetery appeared as I remembered, silent and still, with rows of crumbling graves and statues that had long since lost their detail. I parked near the entrance, grabbing my camera and a tripod from the back seat. The sun had dipped low enough that it was hard to see, but there was enough light left to capture some eerie shots before nightfall. I had planned to stay only for a short while, but as I stepped inside, a strange unease settled over me. The ground was uneven, and the paths winding through the cemetery felt like they were leading me deeper into the unknown. I moved cautiously, looking at the different gravestones, some marked with dates that stretched back over a century. I had no specific reason for being drawn to one particular grave, but something about the area near the old chapel at the back of the cemetery caught my eye. I made my way toward it, stepping carefully around the uneven ground, when I noticed something odd. The air had become thick, almost heavy, and the usual rustling of leaves had stopped entirely. The silence was oppressive, as though the very space around me had paused, waiting. I shook it off as my imagination getting the best of me. There had to be some logical explanation for the stillness, perhaps the weather, or maybe a change in the atmospheric pressure. I pressed on, adjusting my camera's settings. But as I knelt to adjust the tripod, I saw something, or rather, someone, out of the corner of my eye. A figure standing by one of the old graves. I froze. The person appeared to be a woman, though her features were obscured by the growing dusk. She was wearing a dark dress, tattered at the edges, with long, unkempt hair cascading down her back. I assumed it was just another visitor, perhaps someone else who had come to pay their respects. "Excuse me," I called out, stepping toward her. "Are you all right?" There was no response. So the woman didn't turn around, didn't move at all. I felt an icy chill creep over my skin, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Hello?" I called again, but she remained motionless. I hesitated. The wind had picked up now, whipping around me in a sudden gust. It felt colder, more insistent. I decided to move closer just to see if I could get her attention. But the closer I got, the more distant and wrong everything felt. I was only a few feet away when I realized that there was no one there at all. The figure had vanished, as though it had never been there to begin with. I blinked, my heart thumping in my chest, and looked around. Nothing. Confused, I turned back toward the grave I had been photographing, thinking perhaps I had imagined the whole thing. But my eyes fell upon something I hadn't noticed before. A name on a gravestone, etched faintly, nearly obscured by the ivy. It read, Emily Harper, 1862-1891. The name stirred something in my memory, but I couldn't place why it felt so important. Emily Harper. I continued taking photos, but the discomfort lingered. As the night deepened, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than usual, half expecting to see the woman again. It was then I realized something else. I wasn't alone. There were footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I turned around, expecting to find another late-night visitor, but the path behind me was empty. No one in sight. My pulse quickened. It had to be my imagination, I told myself. There was no one else here, but the footsteps persisted, growing louder, as though someone was drawing closer. The sound of shoes on gravel echoed through the cemetery, but I couldn't see who was making them. I was alone, or so I thought. I started walking faster, my footsteps blending with the mysterious ones behind me. My breath came out in short, panicked gasps, and I tried to convince myself it was just an animal or the wind playing tricks. But the footsteps matched mine exactly. When I reached the gate, I didn't stop to look behind me again. I opened the car door with trembling hands, throwing my camera into the passenger seat, and slammed the door behind me. I looked back at the cemetery through the rearview mirror as I started the car. It was a quick glance, but In that split second, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. A figure standing by the gate, her face just visible beneath the dark strands of her hair. It was Emily Harper. I sped away, my hands gripping the wheel, not daring to look back. I never went back to that cemetery. The image of the woman by the gate lingered in my mind, and the chilling footsteps I had heard still echoed in my ears. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched, and I knew that whatever had been in that cemetery, it wasn't human. A few weeks later, I came across an old newspaper article in the local library. It was a small piece, tucked away in the corner of the page. The headline read, "Mysterious Death of Emily Harper, Cause Still Unknown." The article detailed the tragic death of a woman who had been buried in the cemetery, her life shrouded in mystery. Her death was said to be a result of a tragic accident, but no one had ever fully explained how she had ended up alone in the middle of nowhere. The article mentioned one strange detail. Emily had been seen in the cemetery days before her death, standing in the exact spot where I had seen her. Story the end.
Story number 11.
Growing up, I had always heard the stories about Oak Ridge Cemetery. It wasn't just the oldest cemetery in town. It was the one shrouded in superstition and whispered tales of restless spirits. The older kids in the neighborhood dared one another to go in after dark, but no one ever did. I thought the stories were just local folklore until the night I experienced it myself. It was late October, and the air was sharp with the promise of the first frost. My friend Adam and I were driving back from a party when the car broke down just a mile from the cemetery. Adam fiddled with the engine while I stood shivering by the roadside, trying to call for help. The signal was spotty, and after several failed attempts, Adam suggested we cut through the cemetery to reach a gas station on the other side of town. "No way," I said, glancing at the black wrought iron gates looming in the distance. "We can take the long way around." "It'll take an hour," Adam argued. "Come on, it's just a bunch of graves. What's the worst that can happen?" Reluctantly, I agreed. We grabbed flashlights from the trunk and made our way toward the gates. The wind picked up as we approached, rattling the branches of the old oaks that lined the cemetery. I couldn't help but feel like the trees were watching us, their skeletal branches reaching out like claws. Inside, the cemetery was eerily quiet. The gravel paths crunched beneath our feet and the faint smell of damp earth hung in the air. The headstones, some of them cracked and weathered, seemed to lean toward us as if straining to listen. Halfway through, Adam stopped suddenly. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his flashlight trembling in his hand. I froze, straining to hear over the sound of my own breathing. At first, there was nothing. Then, faintly, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on wood. "It's probably just a tree branch," I whispered, though my voice wavered. The tapping grew louder, closer. It seemed to echo from all around us, bouncing off the headstones and disappearing into the night. Adam and I exchanged a nervous glance and quickened our pace. As we neared the center of the cemetery, we came across a large stone mausoleum. Its heavy iron door hung slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. The tapping sound had stopped, replaced by an unnatural silence. "Let's keep moving," I urged, but Adam was already walking toward the mausoleum. "Don't," I said, grabbing his arm. "This isn't a good idea." "Relax," he said, pulling free. "I just want to see what's inside." He disappeared through the doorway, and I was left alone in the darkness. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment the cemetery seemed to come alive. Shadows danced among the graves, and I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. "Adam?" I called, my voice cracking. There was no answer. I took a hesitant step toward the mausoleum, then another. The air grew colder as I approached, my breath visible in the weak beam of my flashlight. Inside, the mausoleum was pitch black, the smell of mildew and decay almost overpowering. "Adam?" I called again, my voice echoing off the stone walls. A figure emerged from the shadows, and I screamed, until I realized it was Adam. "Don't do that!" I hissed, clutching my chest. "Sorry," he said, though his voice sounded distant. "You need to see this." Reluctantly, I followed him deeper into the mausoleum. At the far end was an open coffin, its lid propped against the wall. The wood was old and splintered, and inside lay a pile of bones, yellowed with age. "I think we should go," I said, backing away, but Adam was staring at something on the wall. Carved into the stone was a series of names, each one followed by a date of death. The last name on the list was Adam Brooks, my friend's name with a date that matched that very night. Very funny, I said, though my voice was shaking. You set this up, didn't you? Adam turned to me, his face pale. I didn't, I swear. Before I could respond, the door of the mausoleum slammed shut, plunging us into darkness. The temperature dropped sharply, and I felt a cold breeze brush past me. Who's there? Adam shouted, his voice echoing. A low, guttural laugh filled the room, followed by a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. You shouldn't have come here. The flashlight in my hand flickered and died, leaving us in total darkness. Panic surged through me as I grabbed Adam's arm. We need to get out of here. The sound of footsteps echoed through the mausoleum, though we couldn't see anyone. The air grew heavier, pressing down on my chest, and I struggled to breathe. Suddenly, the coffin lid slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the voice growled, "Leave now, or stay forever." We didn't need to be told twice. Adam and I stumbled toward the door, which had somehow creaked open. Outside, the cemetery was blanketed in a thick fog that hadn't been there before. We ran, tripping over roots and headstones, until we finally reached the gates. When we got back to the road, we didn't stop running until we reached the gas station. The clerk gave us strange looks as we collapsed against the counter, trying to catch our breath. "What happened to you two?" he asked. "Cemetery," Adam managed to say between gasps. Something's in there." The clerk's expression darkened. "You went to Oak Ridge at night? You're lucky you made it out. Not everyone does." We never went back to the cemetery, and we didn't talk about that night again. But sometimes when I'm alone, I can still hear that voice whispering in the back of my mind, "You shouldn't have come here." Story, the end.